So now next we have asked Dr. Alex Crosby to come on screen, Dr. um, Mr. Omar Neal, Mayor Omar Neal to come on screen, and Dr. Riggins Earl is already on screen. And so we got a robust session. We got Brother Eric Montgomery. We have such a robust session for the next hour and a half. So we're going to jump right into it. And we just, like Dr. Warren said just a moment ago, listen, it's us here, right? And we the political, and so we got moral determinants of health, political determinants of health, social determinants of health, all coming together at the same spot at the same exact time to deal with it. And the reason why we could be as frank as we need to be and ought to be is because gun violence, often we at both ends of the gun. And so therefore, this is, where did he go? Oh, Mr. Omani. Okay, therefore, this is just such an important conversation to have. So gentlemen, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm about to bring a young man, Mr. Eric Montgomery. He is, each day we have a BHP honor student to serve as host, and we're honored that one of our presenters today, Mr. Omar Neal, Mayor Neal, and his daughter at one time was a Barakas honor student. So we're thankful for that. And so I'm going to introduce to you Mr. Eric Montgomery, and then we shall launch into a conversation. So let me tell you something about this young man. Mr. Eric Montgomery is a freshman mechanical engineering major and merit scholar to Tuskegee University, originally from Conyers, Georgia. He's an aspiring materials scientist and intends on obtaining a minor in this field. He's currently a member of the Black Campus Ministries, National Society of Black Engineers, the Bioethics Honors Program, and the Ocean Exploration Club here at Tuskegee University. During his high school education, he completed research on the optimization of conductive 3D printing filaments, where he created a composite 3D printing filament. The hope of this research was to reduce the drawbacks of using conductive polylactic acid, PLA, on its own. He also did research on the effects of graphene on solar panel efficiency, where he created a graphene solar cell to test efficiency levels. Both research topics placed second and third, respectively, in the Rockdale County Regional Science Fair. Something ain't right, I'll tell you that right now, because I could barely pronounce this stuff. And the second and third, in addition to research, he also completed diverse internships ranging from invasive species removal in the environment to working with ceramics and in a local art shop. Some of Eric's hobbies outside of school include music, watching TV, that's a lie, and cars. Eric specifically has a love for playing instruments, such as the clarinet and the bass guitar. Eric believes that ethics is important when it comes to conducting research, and hopes to gain knowledge from today's panelists to provide a well-rounded approach to potential research endeavors and for personal knowledge growth. It is vital that when we enter rooms, we are well informed and go in with good intentions. I don't know where you get time to watch TV, Brother Eric. I don't know what you're talking about, because I was, my resume at this time, what you're talking about, I was riding bike, roller skating, and climbing trees in the Virgin Islands and chasing after mangoes. So I don't know, but God bless you, young man. Bless you and bless your family, because we are honored. We are honored. And they're just like with all the young people this week, we are honored to have you in the honors program, because just by reading what I just read, that just says that you're in the right place. So you will bless us as we attempt to bless you. Now, Brother Eric, bring forth Dr. Alex Crosby into the program.
So I just wanted to thank you for reading that bio and all the great compliments. But first, we do have Dr. Alexander Crosby. So Dr. Alexander E. Crosby is a preventative medicine physician in Atlanta, Georgia. He received his medical degree from Howard University College of Medicine and has been in practice for more than 20 years. As a preventative medicine specialist, he works to prevent disease and maintain health in individuals and populations. For Dr. Crosby, public health is a large focus, as is occupational medicine. Dr. Crosby, the floor is now yours.
All right, thank you very much. And I will be able to share my slides from here.
Yes, yes.
Very good. Well, good afternoon to all of you, those of you who are, I guess, at least on the Central and Eastern time zone. There may be some of you, if you're way out there in Hawaii or Alaska, it might still be morning for you out that way. But I want to thank the National Center for Bioethics for Research and Healthcare for the invitation, Dr. Reuben Warren, for inviting me to come and to talk with you. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery, for the introduction. Glad to be here. What I'm going to address today is taking action to reduce gun violence. And as I talk about that, I will describe a little bit about some of the patterns and the prevention of firearm-related injuries. Many of you will have heard about the changes that have occurred in regards to gun violence across the United States, especially this year, but even over the past few years. It seemed like, especially back in the spring, that we were hearing about firearm-related deaths. We were hearing about mass shootings. It seemed like if it wasn't every other day, it was every other week. You know, we were hearing about events that were occurring in schools, events that were occurring in homes, events that were occurring in businesses. We even heard about, you know, some that occurred at a parade, I think on Independence Day. And while it seems like it slowed down a little bit, I mean, there have definitely been some recent events, a recent event in St. Louis, a recent event in Raleigh, North Carolina. So it has not stopped. But are there things that we can do about it? And that's kind of the important thing, that while we have some of these events that are tragedies, there may be more that we can be doing and should be doing to try to prevent these kind of events from occurring. So what I'll do today is I'll describe a little bit about the public health approach, basically just a systematic way of looking at a particular issue. And then what I'll do is I'll show how we can apply that public health approach to firearm-related injuries. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, very good. And let me get to the right version there. So those of you, just to make sure that I'm showing the right thing, it looks like it's in the presentation mode. Give me a thumbs up if that looks like that's the right thing. All right, thank you very much. And just to give you the disclaimer, what I present today is, the way I'll put it, is on me. So even though I work at the Morehouse School of Medicine, this does not represent the official position of Morehouse School of Medicine as I present this information today. I have no financial relationships to disclose, and I will not be endorsing any proprietary healthcare products. The outline of what I'm going to do, as I mentioned, is talk about the public health approach and show its application to firearm-related injuries. Public health approach is really kind of depicted in 4 steps: describing the problem, identifying risk and protective factors, developing and evaluating programs and policies, and then disseminating and implementing what is known. And I'll show you kind of a depiction of what that looks like, and then also show how you can apply that to firearm-related injuries. Our objectives for today is to describe why firearm-related injuries are an important health issue, and hopefully when we finish today, you will have an understanding of that, describe the magnitude of firearm-related injuries, and then identify some examples of useful interventions to prevent firearm-related injuries. This is the public health approach, and you can kind of see it depicted as these 4 different activities. I depict it as a cycle because oftentimes these things are going on at the same time and one leads to the next, which also informs the next one. The public health approach really tries to answer some foundational questions, regardless of what the issue is. So you might be talking about HIV, you might be talking about maternal mortality, you might be talking about infant mortality, you could be talking about cancer, cardiovascular disease, COVID-19, whatever it is, it can apply to the public health approach, but you want to describe what's the problem, what could we do to prevent it from occurring, and then to answer those questions, what we try to do is use a systematic scientific method for understanding and preventing whatever that particular issue is. From it's starting off kind of, if you're looking at the green, defining and monitoring the problem, that kind of gets at the who, what, when, where of any particular issue. We're going to describe the trends. We're going to see whether it's occurring more in rural areas or urban areas, what's happening in regards to maybe certain age groups more at risk, having higher rates than others. What about males versus females? So we're defining that problem. Given some of those answers, we'll hopefully at the same time kind of look for what's in the orange, identifying the risk and protective factors, and that's really trying to get at the why. So if we can describe what the problem is, if we know what's going on in regards to firearm-related injuries, now we got to figure out why. Why are those things occurring? Why is it occurring in those populations more than others? Why in those communities more than some other communities? Then, if we've got some answers as to why, sometimes we don't get everything definitive in regards to the why, but then we can move to developing and testing the prevention strategies in the blue. So now if we understand the why, if we know, for example, maybe alcohol misuse plays a big role in interpersonal violence and the use of firearms in interpersonal violence, okay, how can we address the issue of alcohol misuse in communities? And there are ways. And then we kind of move from developing that intervention, testing it out to see whether it works or not, and then moving into that purple, disseminating successful strategies widely. If we know what works, we also may know what doesn't work. Now we can get that information, what we've learned in kind of the first three levels, make sure that we're getting that information out. As we learned how we could do a pilot program in this school, now can we take it and apply it to the rest of this school district? What about the rest of the state? What about the rest of the country? What about internationally? So hopefully we're able to take the information that we've learned and pass that along. Let's start off with defining and monitoring the problem regarding firearm-related injuries. This is the most recent data that we've got, final data, in regards to mortality in the United States. Leading causes of death in 2020, the 2021 data, they've got some preliminary data, but the final data probably out in about a month or so. One of the things you notice here is in terms of heart disease starting on the top, number one, and then cancer, and then COVID, and going on down the list, that you see number 11 is suicide, but you don't see anywhere on here firearm-related injury. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean it's not a leading cause of death? And actually, we had some researchers that have looked at this a couple of different times, and part of what they said is these international classification of disease codes, and that's how we code, you know, what a person dies from and what's on the death certificate. They said that doesn't give us the total answer of what's going on. Because if you go back and you take a look at it, and when they looked at this, there's a couple of different things. You can see the sources down on the bottom. They said, well, heart disease, you know, what are some of the leading factors that put somebody at risk of dying of a myocardial infarction, of a heart attack? Well, we got to know a little bit more about heart disease. Well, we know tobacco is a big cause. We know that poor diet, high cholesterol, hypertension, those are some of the causes that lead to heart disease. So what they said is that what we need to know a little bit more about is the actual causes of death. We've got these leading causes of death that come from those codes, but let's take a look at these actual causes of death that predispose somebody of dying of heart disease, dying of cancer, dying of unintentional injuries. And so they put together this other list to say, we need to be focusing on tobacco because that leads to heart disease. What about poor diet, physical inactivity? That leads to cancers and leads to heart disease. And of course, you see what I've highlighted there in orange, firearms would have been the 8th leading cause of death in terms of looking at the mechanism of what people died for. As I mentioned, suicides ended up being just number 11. Homicides was about number 15, but there's some things about those two different causes of death that tell us a little bit more about what's going on. Over 45,000 people in 2020, the mechanism of their death was a firearm. A little bit more detail about firearm-related injuries. One is 45,000 deaths, as I mentioned. That's over 123 firearm-related deaths every day, and over 200 people shot or wounded every day in the United States. And a firearm is used in 1 out of every 2 suicides. So about half of the suicides, half of the deaths related to suicide in the United States, a firearm is the mechanism. 3 out of every 4 homicides, almost 75% of all the homicides in the United States, a firearm was the mechanism. In terms of the medical costs, if you just look at the medical costs, mental health services costs, $64 billion a year. If you look overall at some of the lifetime costs, $35 million per year, over $557 billion per year in terms of overall cost. Another way of just looking at the patterns across the world, the way the World Health Organization categorizes nations in order to make some comparison when they compare health indicators, infant mortality or life expectancy or chronic disease or disability across different nations. One of the ways they try to do that is looking at high income countries, compare them to each other, middle income countries, compare them to each other, low income countries, compare them to each other. So you have a better comparison than comparing a country that's low income to a country that's high income. Supposedly, the high income country should have more resources, better technology, better ability to respond to health crises and health indices than a low-income country. So here, the United States is put on a graph with other high-income countries. You can see where we stand out, right? You focus on the left side of this graph, and you see in terms of firearm-related deaths, the United States above and beyond everybody else. You can see our rates are about 11 per 100,000. Even the countries that are maybe about number 2, Austria, Switzerland, are less than a third of what we have in terms of firearm-related death rates. So here's a place in which you don't want to be number 1, right? You don't want to be number 1 in terms of this cause of mortality. What can we be doing about this? As I mentioned, when we look at firearm-related deaths by intent, that's dividing them up by how many were suicides, how many were homicides, how many had to do with legal intervention, unintentional. One of the things you see here is that over half of the firearm-related deaths were suicide. So when you hear people talk about, we've got to address gun violence, oftentimes people are thinking in terms of gun violence about just the interpersonal, just the homicides, but you'd be missing over half of it. If you didn't talk about gun violence, we also have to address suicide-related gun violence, you'd be missing half of it. So all the case that I'm making here is that we need to be looking at both. When we're talking about firearm-related or gun violence, homicides, as well as suicides, just in terms of the deaths. When we look at non-fatal, a different picture. Again, it's helping us to focus. As we get the information about what the patterns are, we can identify where our interventions might be focused. Here you can see for unintentional, not for unintentional, but for non-fatal injuries, assaults, almost 76%, over 3/4 of the non-fatal firearm-related injuries are related to assault, so interpersonal violence. Here's just a pattern of looking at firearm-related death rates among all persons by age group and by sex. Here you can kind of see a couple of different peaks. When you look at the orange, where males predominate in terms of their rates, much higher than females, but you can see this high rates in adolescents and young adults. Then it kind of drops down as you get into middle age, then comes back up again. When you look at older adults, well, what's going on here? Why do we see this, if we talk about a bimodal pattern, what's going on with this bimodal pattern? Let's take a look at the The next one, and it helps us to understand that a little bit more, here we're looking at by intent, firearm-related deaths by intent. Here we can see that what that peak is in adolescents and young adults has to do with firearm homicide. What happens among older adults, firearm suicide. So again, how do we try to make sure that when we're thinking about trying to address this problem, that we're thinking about both of the, not only males versus females, but also we're looking at intent. How do we focus on suicides? Maybe we focus more on prevention of firearm-related suicides when we talk about older adults, whereas if we're talking about prevention of firearm-related homicides, we might focus a little bit more on adolescents and young adults. Here are the rates when you look at them by ethnicity. You can see some different patterns emerging here. When you look at those that are white, NH, non-Hispanic, their higher rates are among firearm suicides. When you look at Black non-Hispanics, much higher rates, firearm homicide. Go down and look at American Indian, Alaska Natives, almost equal in terms of homicide, firearm homicide and firearm suicide, but definitely higher than a lot of the other groups. Again, where do we focus? We're understanding the patterns. We're looking at the who, what, when, where of this particular issue. All right, so where do we try to focus our interventions? Maybe in certain populations, maybe on certain age groups, maybe by sex. There are different ways in which we can try to target populations that might help us. This is looking at the trends over time in regards to firearm-related death rates. I'll just try to draw your attention here towards the end. You can see, even though we've heard a lot about firearm homicides, especially between 2020, 2021, 2022, that if you kind of look here, it started going up in about 2014. So this has been not just a recent last couple of years phenomenon. That spike looks like it has definitely gone up in the past couple of years, but it's been kind of gradually percolating up over the past few years. You can see too that firearm homicides, less than firearm suicides, even back when you look at the early 90s, where the trends were fairly close and the rates were fairly close, that was still several thousand more people dying as a result of firearm suicide than homicides. So it's important for us to understand what's happening in regards to these trends. Here are firearm related and non-firearm related homicides. Part of what you see here is, again, kind of looking at the non-firearm related homicides. Except for September 11th, the trend is kind of down in regards to non-firearm homicides, whereas when you look at firearm homicides in the gray, the trend over the past 7 or 8 years it's been going up. You had a slight little pause there around 2017, but it's been going up since that time. I'm just going to give a couple of notes about mass shootings. And, one of the things I'll say about, my slide here in regards to mass shootings is it was like something I just had to keep on updating and updating and updating. So I just stopped. There was more. It just kept on going. So it just stopped. And you can see that there are, some patterns regarding mass shootings and the casualties, the number of events that we've had in the United States just since 2009, over 279 total events of mass shootings. And you could see, if you look down on the bottom, this is coming from Everytown organization, and the way they describe it, and you get different definitions. FBI has one definition, Everytown has another definition. There's some different groups that have different definitions of what a mass shooting is, whether they're talking about 3 or more people, whether they talk about are all fatalities versus non-fatal, and how many people, how many victims are involved. But here with Everytown, they talk about 4 or more people shot or killed, excluding the shooter. Another thing to understand, and this is just about mass shootings, and again, these are really just kind of the tip of the pyramid in regards to all the homicides and the firearm-related injuries. But something important for us to understand, and if you look at the pie chart on the left, part of what you see is that many of the mass shootings occur in the home. If we paid attention to the news and the news only, we would think most of them are happening in schools, or most of them are happening, out in the street somewhere. Most of them happen in the homes. as you might imagine, what that means is if you're talking about they're happening in the homes, you're talking about intimate partner violence and child violence. So here's where you see most of them occurring. You can kind of move over to the circumstance, the pie chart on the right, and you can see that family-related violence represents over half of them. Sometimes, as in the case with this recent event in Raleigh, it started in the home and then moved out into the street. The perpetrator, the suspect, started off shooting members of the family and then went out into the street and shot somebody. If we also think about a couple of the high-profile cases up in Newtown, Connecticut, you think about that person that went into the school and shot the school, the first person he shot was his mother in the house. Then he went to the school and shot some more folks. The same kind of thing, similar kind of circumstance in Uvalde, Texas. Person shot his grandmother first, then he goes to the school and shoots up folks at the school. So again, sometimes they start in the home and then move out into the public. This is just a map showing in circles where some of the mass shootings have occurred across the United States. Bigger the circle, the more victims that have occurred. One of the things about this particular map is that you start looking across the United States, almost every state has had something. So this is happening all over the United States. There's a couple of states I was looking at. I was trying to figure out maybe they didn't have anything. Looks like maybe Nebraska and Iowa didn't have anything, but almost every other state, there's been a mass shooting. That's not even talking about, if we talk about the other kinds of homicides, non-mass shooting homicides, but almost every state has had them all across the country. All right, identifying risk and protective factors. We'll move on. Again, kind of keep in mind that homicides and suicides have some different risk factors involved. Some things are similar, but other things are not. One of the ways to look at it is what's called the social ecological model. You can look at the individual level. What are some of the factors there? At the family and peer level, what about those factors? At the community level, and then at the societal level, you can see things like impulsivity, like substance use, like social isolation versus social support can make a difference. Social support being a protective factor, whereas social isolation is more of a risk factor. When you look at things like in the family and peer level, the second one down is seasonal. Oftentimes we see in the United States that during the summer, homicides go up, firearm homicides go up. So again, here's something that we understand what the patterns are. Okay, so what can we do about this pattern of seeing homicides go up during the summer? You can see some of these other risk factors. We'll move on. Developing and testing interventions. And so one of the ways to look at this, this was done actually by William Haddon back in the 1960s, in which he started looking at motor vehicle crashes. Most people talked about them as in motor vehicle accidents. People think an accident, you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, we couldn't have done anything. What William Haddon said is that, wait a minute, let's scientifically look at these motor vehicle crashes. And then what he did is he figured out, actually, there's some patterns to this, some things that we can identify and actually look at how to prevent them. So one of the things he did, looking across that top row, is he identified there's an agent, there's a host, which is usually the human. You have a physical environment and a social environment. And then he looked along the side, that column there, before the event occurred, during the event, and then post-event. Now, if we can understand some of those things, we can actually take some of this, and actually he developed some of this from looking at infectious disease. We can take some of this and apply it to injury. We can apply it to motor vehicle injuries. We can apply it to firearm-related injuries. One of the ways to look at it is there are some firearm-specific injury prevention approaches. That's really kind of focusing on the agent in this term. It's not the motor vehicle, but it's the firearm. So what can we do about the firearm in order to try to prevent firearm-related injuries? Here are some of the strategies, the policies that regulate who may legally own, purchase, or possess a firearm, policies regulating firearm sales and transfers, policies regulating the legal use, storage, and carrying of firearms. Some of these have been tested out. There's evidence to them. I'll just go down to the very bottom row there, where it talks about child access prevention laws have been shown to work in regards to prevention of suicide and unintentional injury, especially unintentional firearm injury among youth. and especially among children. There are other ways of focusing on prevention. So not just the agent, the actual mechanism, but what about some of the intent? As we talked about, homicides and suicides are the major intent in regards to firearm-related injuries and deaths. What if we focus on the interpersonal violence, the assault-related connection to homicides? Here are some of the evidence-based and promising interventions that have been proven and successful in regards to interpersonal violence. Youth interpersonal violence: promote family environments that support healthy development, provide quality education early in life. I'd stop there for just a minute, because some of these interventions don't have the word violence in them at all. You can look at how can we support our society. And that second one, if you can imagine something like, and some of you are going to be familiar with the Perry preschool program. They did longitudinal studies of those children. These are 3 and 4-year-olds, right, that have gone through a pre-K program. They did longitudinal studies when they're into their 20s and 30s and found that one of the outcomes, not just educational outcome, but in terms of violence, in terms of interaction with the criminal justice system, much lower among those that had gone through a program when they're 3 and 4 years old. And now you measure them when they're 20 years later, 30 years later. There's some influence of that later on in life. You strengthen the youth skills is another one. Connecting youth to caring adults. Mentoring programs, after school programs have been shown to lower violence, lower firearm-related injuries, and creating protective community environments and lessening harms, intervening to lessen harm. So this is on the interpersonal violence side. When you look at the suicide side, there's some things that are actually very similar. There's some things that are different, but some that are very similar. One of the things you mentioned in terms of youth skills, and you go down to the third one from the bottom, teaching coping and problem-solving skills. Works for both. Different kinds of skills, but there's ways in which you can incorporate the skills that are protective against interpersonal violence and the skills that are protective against self-directed violence. Those can work too. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm going to jump back to the very top one: strengthening economic supports, strengthening household financial security and housing stabilization policies. We know that those that, in terms of socioeconomic status, if we can strengthen socioeconomic status, if we can also prevent people from being housing insecure, both of those two things actually show that they decrease suicide. So here, some intervention problems that don't say suicide in them, but yes, they've been able to measure them and show that they prevent suicide. Just something to think about: a cartoon, editorial cartoon that I saw in the newspaper. It talks about something that only in America. Those of you who remember the Ford Pinto that had the gas tank in the back of the car, a couple of rear end incidents in which the car caught on fire and exploded, recalled it after 27 deaths. You also remember there was somebody that was, putting toxins, putting poisons into the Tylenol. They recalled that after 7 deaths, but we got firearms that are responsible for over 32,000. As you saw in 2020, over 45,000 deaths per year, but no recall, right? Very little in regards to legislation to try and prevent firearm-related injuries. And then lastly, dissemination. What do we do about that? In the Department of Health and Human Services, every 10 years, they have a healthy people objectives for the nation. So in 2000, in 2010, in 2020, in 2030, there are 3 of them that relate specifically to firearm-related injuries. There are other ones that relate to suicide prevention and others that relate to interpersonal violence prevention. But you can see along the left side, reducing firearm-related deaths, reducing non-fatal firearm-related injuries, and reducing gun carrying among adolescents are 3 of the objectives for the nation for 2030. In conclusion, firearm-related injuries are a leading mechanism of injury and death in the United States. There is a need that exists for improved and expanded surveillance and research on this topic. We definitely need to know more, especially in regards to looking at non-fatal injuries, and also more research on some of the protective factors regarding firearm-related injuries. We need to implement the best available approaches now. As you saw, I had several different documents that have done reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses to show that there are programs that really do work, but part of it is they've not been implemented very widely. And then more prevention programs need to be developed and evaluated. So we've got a small menu right now. We go into a restaurant, there's only 2 pages to it. It'd be nice if we got a menu that's got about 10 pages that we can say, because when we look at adaptation, if we want to take a program and apply it in New York, apply it in Detroit, apply it in rural Alabama, apply it in rural Georgia, apply it in suburban areas, apply it to this population, apply it to these young people, apply it to middle-aged folks, apply it to all these different groups and populations, it's better to have a wider range of options so that we know we don't have to do a whole lot of adaptation in order to get this program to work. It's already been tried out in a population very similar to ours. All we've got to do is effectively implement it, don't have to adapt it very much. So we need more programs, but we could do more with the programs we already have that have been demonstrated that they work. Thank you very much. Talked about the public health approach, showed how you could apply that public health approach to firearm-related injuries. Thank you for your attention, and look forward to hearing more in terms of the discussion and the questions and answers. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crosby. You didn't miss a step, but you did a great job in terrifying us. Okay, because that graphic of the United States versus everybody else is horrific. It is absolutely horrific. And so I want to hold the questions now, and I would like because there's so much and that we have to deal with, and I don't want it to go so long that we miss anybody. But one of the things that was on that graphic, that Japan, Korea, and the UK certainly have figured something out, and that's amazing. So I would ask Dr. Ruben Warren now to introduce Mayor Omar Neal, and Mr. Mayor Neal is going to go and present to us. He is a former police officer, and he'll present, and then Mr. Eric Montgomery is going to present Dr. Riggins Earl. Dr. Warren?
I'm just about to exhale from Dr. Crosby's presentation. It was fantastic. One question in the question and answer period I really want you to address is the whole issue of the relationship between homicide and legal intervention. They kind of keep them separate, but they, in many ways, particularly as it relates to the African-American community, they're one and the same. I asked Dr. Hodge to let me butt in and introduce Mayor Neal. And I asked that because when I came to Tuskegee in 2009, I'd been in and around Tuskegee, passing through, and I was kind of new to be here full time. So, when you come to a new city, you try to go see the mayor. And in other cities where I've been, you had to get in line and make an appointment and do all those things and to see the mayor. I walked in and said, I'd like to talk to the mayor, and I got right in. So, when I got to talking with Mayor Neal, I said, that I'm becoming to feel right at home in Tuskegee. And he said, look, I don't know where you've been, but when you come to Tuskegee, you're at home. So I've been at home ever since. I want to thank you, Mayor, for that. Mayor Neal has been a long supporter of the things we're doing in the Bioethics Center. And equally as important, he's been in many places and done many things, and he continues to do them. I reference him as a street scholar because he knows the folks know him, and he does a wonderful job. And he's a Tuskegee alum. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Let me close by saying something that's really, really important, is that he's a a very active member in the Voice for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation. And those are the descended family members of the men who we in the United States Public Health Service SIFTA study at Tuskegee. He is a champion for truth and a champion for justice. And I just wanted to thank him publicly for the work he's done, and more importantly, the work that he's doing now and going to do in the future. So again, Mayor Neal, have your word with us, please.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Warren, and my mentor and friend. It's always good to be in your presence and to be in this kind of company. It's just incredible, the work that is being done that oftentimes many people don't see from the masses. The public don't see these kinds of exchanges, and I want to see how we can get this out more. Dr. Crosby, if I were in church, I would say, let's do the benediction now, because you have already preached the sermon, and you, the proverbial mic has been dropped in terms of your presentation. It was incredible, very comprehensive, and I think it hit on many of the salient points that has given rise to this violence that we find in not only the African American community, but around the country and even around the world. You know, when I thought about coming forth to have just some kind of reflections, I hearken back to 1971 with the great philosopher Marvin Gaye, where he said, "Mother, mother, there's far too many of you crying. Brother, brother, there's far too many of you dying. We got to find a way to bring some loving here today." And I think that if we are to address, I mean, I'm talking about at the foundational level, we got to address, why are people so dismissive of humanity? This notion of having value as a human seemed to be at the cornerstone of the violence that we see, as in my opinion. You know this notion, and Dr. Warren, you're so profound when you said, you know, we can deal with politics because politics is public health. You were right. And racism is also at the cornerstone and very integral to this conversation as well. And it was Neely Fuller that said, if you don't understand racism, then anything else you think you understand will only serve to confuse you. And so I think it's important that we began to explore, why do some people feel that they are valueless? And why do other people feel that they are valuable? I remember growing up in Tuskegee, where we used to say, white you're right, yellow you're mellow, brown stick around, black get back. And it was this kind of hierarchy of humanity that was established, that somehow Black people were at the bottom of the totem pole of humanity, and sometimes not even at all. And I think until we can address this notion of the value of people, we cannot deal with the fact that people discard those things that are not valuable. And they also feel no remorse for discarding other things that they do not value. When we use a tissue, we don't have any problem with discarding it after it's being used, right? There's no remorse for that. And I think that as we began to explore violence in the African American community, we have to ask ourselves, who do we value? And who do we not value? This notion of being a police officer, I started out back in 1975 as being the youth aid police, the director. In fact, I wrote the proposal for the youth aid division for the police department, and I currently train police officers now in de-escalation, implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and effective communication. But what I recognized even then, that many of our young people were were part of a cultural phenomena that was violence centered. When you look at the music and when you look at the other cultural expressions, whether or not it's movies or videos or whatever, we are inundated with this notion of violence. It is a part of what we call entertainment. And anytime you can embrace something that's entertainment, it becomes an okay thing. And I think that has kind of extended itself into our interpersonal relationships. Because if I have a conflict, the way that I resolve my conflict is with this gun, this thing that I call power, because that's where my power lies, is in my finger and the trigger. And this notion of assault. I talk to young people all the time. They talk about being dissed. And that means disrespected. And the notion, if you do something that that disrespects me, then the consequences of that has to be for me to take your life. I can recall training a group of people at the Department of Human Resources. This was a welfare to work program. And I was training, and had two students in the back of the class were chatting as I was talking. And I stopped them. I said, would you like to share with the class what you're talking about, since I'm up here trying to train? And they said, no, Mr. Neal, we don't want to tell you what is happening. I said, well, it's okay, you can tell it. They were talking about three guys who had come to their homes. These were two young ladies, had come to their home the night before. And they said that they went out and they robbed someone and they killed him. And the three young guys came back to their home. And one of the guys who was a part of the original murder was acting a little afraid, or he was freaking out, as you would say, as you would say. And do you know, they went out and took him out and killed him and then came back to the same house? And the young ladies were talking about it in such a casual way that it showed me that they did not value the humanity, not only of the person they didn't know, but even the person that they knew. And when we become so desensitized to death, so numb to death, it's easy for people to kill people. And so I hearken back to where I started. Until we learn to love ourselves first, because you can't love another person until you first learn to love yourself. Until we can incorporate emotional intelligence from the early ages, we have to begin to incorporate that even before folk go to school. And then we have to be able to deal with and address the issue of vicarious trauma that leads to compassion fatigue, where our young people particularly, and the reason why I'm focusing on young people is because that's normally the demographics that I see in terms of killing each other, right? And this notion that somehow, as a young age, I can give up on life, that I don't see, because suicide is really the epitome of hopelessness, where you condition or you conclude that your condition is intolerable and that it's not going to change. And homicide, I see as an external suicide, is to kill folk who look like you primarily, rather than killing yourself, but really it's killing yourself as well. And so as we explore this, I want to begin to ask us to challenge ourselves to look beyond just the fact that people are dying, but why? To ask the whys they're dying. And yes, as the last thing I'll say, has to do with what I heard from Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow. And she was asked the question about gun violence as we are discussing today. And she said, you know, I live in a community where people have guns, but we don't have gun violence at the same level that they have it in the African-American community, generally speaking, or more impoverished communities, or the inner city, as they call it. And she say, the reason why is because not only do we have guns in our community, but we also have good schools. We also have opportunities for employment, and we have ways by which interventions and protective factors, as Dr. Crosby was talking about, we have those other things that mitigate against the violence. Until we are able to balance those things out, we will not make measurable progress until we understand that. And my last statement is this. It's love. And love is an acronym for me. It's leaving others very encouraged. Well, I thank you for the love that you've given me today, because I'm encouraged by this conversation. Dr. Crosby, thank you so much, my man. Thank you for the work you're doing. It was incredible what I experienced today. I will never forget it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, man, Neal. I appreciate that. That's exactly what I wanted you to do. Put some life on this, to the numbers that Dr. Crosby was giving us. Thank you so much. Doctor, you call you doctor, that's in your future, Eric. So Mr. Montgomery is going to now give us an introduction to Dr. Riggins Earl, and then Dr. Earl will give us the ethics of gun violence, and then we'll start taking our questions. Mr. Montgomery will govern the questions. So, Mr. Montgomery?
Thank you. Dr. Riggins Earl is a professor of ethics and theology at the Interdenominational Theological Center of the Atlanta University Center, where he has served for 30 plus years. He holds a doctorate degree from Vanderbilt University in social ethics. He has done postdoctoral studies at Harvard and Boston University, respectively. Dr. Earl has done research at the London Institute for African Studies, taught in the Religious Studies Department of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and taught religion in the university and seminary context for 40 years. During that tenure, he has sought to be at the forefront of intellectual conversations about religion and the ethical and moral life, particularly as it relates to Black Americans. Dr. Earl, the floor is yours.
He got disconnected. He was here the whole time, and he got disconnected at the end. Okay, here we go. Dr. Earl? Dr. Earl?
Okay. Yes, sir. You hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you. We can see the
Can't see
ceiling.
me. All right. Let's see if we can deal with
There you go.
visibility. Visibility of my otherness, huh?
That's right.
All right. Let's see. Mr. Montgomery, thank you very much. Dr. Hodge has pinned on you what we expect you to become. You're in the process of being and becoming. Keep up the good work. Mr. Neal, Officer Neal, and Dr. Crosby, Dr. Warren, Dr. Hodge, and the whole crew. I have sat here and with great amazement and listened to just the staggering presentations starting with Dr. Shaw. And there's a question that I want to at least put on the table. It's already been on the table, but we probably didn't hear it that well. And I want to ride the horse on this one, because at my age and my research and writings, etc., and having taught the discipline of ethics for more than one generation, I'm really troubled by what I see and hear in the Black community, or what I don't hear in the Black community. Not that I have a panacea, or what I'm going to say is a panacea to any of this, but I think it will help to deal with where we challenge the next generation for where we might ought to, where we are challenged to go. Let me put it that way. Starting yesterday when we began these conversations, it occurred to me that, wow, something has happened. The Ethics Center is what is it, 20 years old? It's been operative for about 20 years.
25.
25. And in the 25 years, obviously, we have made contributions that can't be measured or scientifically evaluated. And I think that's the problem. Dr. Crosby's work measures. He brings statistics. Dr. Shaw's work brings the statistics. And even Mr. Neal's work brings statistics. Because even when you're dealing with criminology, the criminologist comes in and examines the data that you have gathered as a police officer and deal with the whole issue of crime, homicide, suicide, etc. But when people talk about ethics and the moral life, from the great philosophers of old to the present, we don't scientifically measure that, the results of it. And I think that's why universities have, in large numbers, have shied away from even teaching ethics or teaching moral philosophy. In most schools, it's considered, especially Black schools, they have sought to get rid of the programs and saying it's not financially feasible. So I think that we have to raise the question, what does this center offer? People like Mr. Neal, Dr. Crosby, School of Medicine, what does these conversations, in what way? Why do we need these conversations in the first place? Because people will say, well, they don't pay my bills. I don't I don't need to, I'm not interested in all these metaphysical answers. Because when you deal with, as ethicists, what we know is that when you deal with all the questions that have been put on the table from the scientific public health community, we then, as Mr. Neal pointed out, we have got to deal with character. Because character has to do with my ability to evaluate your worth, the worth of the other, and the value of the other to my existence. Why are you important? Why am I important to you? Why are you important to me? And we live in a society now that really cares very little about such questions. So the question is, for me, In what way did the Ethics Center at Tuskegee start out struggling with these kinds of questions? And I thought Mr. Shaw really got at it when he raised the question about what is going on in universities in terms of ethics that would help us, or are these programs in higher education now based on dollars and cents rather than programs that would help us to understand what it means to be and do in a society, and what is my worth in relationship to the other, and vice versa. I think this is the curse on America. And we don't want to face it because materialism is too good for some of us. We would rather just think of it as, oh, well, that's the way the preacher talks. That's the way the professor in philosophy talks. And they are raising questions that I have no interest in. The question to me is, why do we want to have, or can we have, and this is a rather soul-searching question for me. Can we have a center that deals with ethical values connected with a university, any university that is interested merely in dollars and cents? This to me is the hard question, that because I have, when I think about where I started as a kid, a youngster, like Mr. Montgomery in college and university, and think of the civil rights movement where people made outcry against violence of racism, classism. And the people who taught us often got very little money, but were calling on us, especially Dr. King, to make a life. Dr. Mays, to make a life. And here we are now with all this knowledge, all this information, all these accomplishments, and we still are cursed. We are cursed worse now by violence than ever. Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee, made an argument to white philanthropists in his day. And his argument was, he was trying to uplift us from the dungeons of slavery, to get our minds out of the dungeons of slavery. And he tried to show white people statistically that if you educate us, we will not be the criminals that you think we are. I'm not sure that education in general, education is going to make us less inclined to kill. But I think it will make a contribution to teaching us and helping us to struggle with the values of being and otherness, whether it's the males valuing the female or vice versa. It's not that we don't have the knowledge now. We have knowledge. The knowledge that we have is so inuit, it so floods us that we don't have the wisdom to discern it and the wisdom to appropriate it. Or maybe we think we do when we don't. Interestingly enough, the mass killings, so many of the mass killings were not from youngsters who were not literate. They were from people who, and now what the scientific community said was, well, they have a mental illness. And of course, the debate is what one of us don't have some mental challenges in the kind of society we live in. But how do we rear up a generation? And maybe we won't be able to fully do it, but why aren't we raising the question? This is the only Black ethics center in the country that I know of. If any of you know of any others, let me know. How do we, as intellectual Blacks, professional Blacks, do we really value this? Is this really something we think we ought to have? Or do we have it because President Clinton apologized and said, you know, here are the funds to start it? I think these are the kind of hard questions we have to ask, because what you are doing here at this institute, at this center in Tuskegee with high school students and with college students is foundational. But where are we doing it in all the HBCU schools that we have? How many programs do we have that, or if we don't have those programs in those schools, to what degree are we utilizing what goes on at the Tuskegee National Bioethics Center to undergird the mission of these HBCUs? Mr. Shaw comes to us with, he comes to us really, as I heard him, from the margins. I think he's been at Harvard and different places. But then he talks about this is a private enterprise that he's working with now. I think I heard him correctly. If I didn't, please correct me. But the question then becomes, can we find Black people, not just whites, but Black people in the community who would want to sponsor what we are doing at the Tuskegee Bioethics Center and want to be patrons of these kinds of inquiries? Or do we see it as a futility, exercise in futility? I think we'll have to do that. Mr. Neal talks to us about, that story you told about the young man, the youngsters who killed, and then they come back and kill the one that they get nervous about, suspicious about, as to what he's going to tell. And the ladies tell the story with, it's kind of entertainment. God dog it. Are we headed to the pits of hell in terms of our moral senses? Have we become so, and I don't think education alone will cure this, but have we become so insensitive to the worth and the value of the other that we are willing? I've watched stories on similar to what Mr. Neal is talking about, because for years I worked with Dr. Walter Fluker, and we ran what we called a street academy. We worked in Detroit in the summers. We taught in the university, and then in the summers, we worked with these youngsters that we had to have the police to help us manage. Police academy, the police department of the city would send in some police help, and they weren't always in uniform, but they came in to help us teach and try to work with these youngsters, these teenagers. So the issue now is, for me, can we sell the Black community, not just in the universities, but in police departments and others on the value of trying to get youngsters to hear the hard questions of life, not just to do math or the technical skills of engineering, but to deal with the worth of otherness. We know, we have the knowledge. We have studied the slave trade. We have studied the cruelty of the Western civilization and what it did by enslaving us. Some of us know, we know that stuff inside and out. At least some of it anyway. I need not be too arrogant about it in terms of knowing all of it. But we know enough to know that it was wrong. It was criminal. It was barbaric. And at the same time, how do we help our communities to invest in that which will help us help our children? Not so much, because we know that locking youngsters, just incarcerating people is not going to solve this problem. I'll tell you a story that happened, and I'll end this, that happened, and if you can read it in the literature, with John Lewis and a number of others during the sit-ins when they in the bus ride, the Freedom Ride, when groups of blacks got on buses along with some liberal whites and rode through the South trying to open up, or at least trying to make the law that that had been passed work. The Supreme Court's decision about public transportation and also eating at public facilities. Some of you might have remembered that, but if you don't remember it, Mr. Montgomery and others of your colleagues, go back and watch the documentary and see how these people were brutally treated by the law enforcement system at that time in the South, and how they took them to Parchman's farm in Mississippi and brutalized them and sought to break their will. We know, and of course they stood the test, and some came out crippled for life as a result of what happened. So we are aware that from prison camps and in the wars of what prison camps did to us, etc., what it did to human beings, period, that the answer is not in violence. We can't use violence to change the violent. I think most of us will agree with that. So how do institutions, how does the National Bioethics Center, in what way does it become an information center for helping us to see where we are and to see some of the things that our presenters have introduced us to? I hope that it will. I hope that younger people will catch fire and catch enthusiasm for not only wanting to know, have the knowledge and understanding of this, but also how do we help to change society for the better. In Detroit, I used to hear kids brag about on the streets in the summers when we were running this program. They would brag about how they would torture teachers, set their cars afire, etc., etc. And they were wearing some of the best clothing, the fashionable tennis shoes and sports clothing. At the same, and yes, they come from homes that had little, but they were wearing the best of everything. And they were also did not know, as many kids who are middle class and upper middle class, that they are suffering from moral poverty. Moral poverty. And maybe they come from families that suffer from moral poverty. I get kids who think, well, if you're just middle class, you'll be all right. And then you say, well, the middle class, the mass killers are coming from the middle class. They're not the poor white hillbillies. It's something else that we've got to deal with that's deeper and more profound than we can see visibly. This society is suffering from what the philosophers and the great moral teachers of Western civilization, and not just Western civilization, but even from colonialized Africa, have tried to teach us. Mandela and the rest of us, Mandela and the rest have tried to teach us that is something deeper in the soul of the human being that we have got to address. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I really wanted to thank all of our speakers. Y'all did an amazing job, and y'all really have brought to light some of the things that I haven't even thought about dealing with gun violence. So now we want to open up the question and answer period. So my first statement was to Dr. Crosby, and it was from Barry Williams, who said, "Very good presentation. I agree, more prevention programs are needed." Then we have a question from, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Lachan Faro. And they start off by saying, for Americans aged 10 to 24, firearm death rates for Black American youth were 20 times higher than white Americans in 2020, and nearly 25 times higher in 2021. Question: how should we understand this fact that we know is a moral issue, and what should the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee, in partnership with HBCUs and others, do with what we know about this horrifying fact?
Well, that's an interesting comment and a question, and I want to kind of go to a couple of things and try to answer that. One was, and I'm going to come back to Dr. Warren's question about the legal intervention. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But one of the things that Dr. Riggins just raised was about this issue of where does bioethics fit into some of the different aspects of what we're talking about, maternal disparities, maternal inequities in terms of maternal health outcomes, infant mortality, firearm-related violence, and just to relate part of it, because I don't think I can answer all of that question. I think what Dr. Riggins asked was a much bigger question, but I'll say that one of the reasons that, when I was in medical school, that I was attracted to public health was the issue of social justice. And I think when we talk about social justice and doing the best for the broadest number of people, that was the thing that attracted me to public health and to medicine, is to think about, okay, this is not just for this little group over here, or that little group over there, or this group that's high on the totem pole, if you will. We really need to think about how we can promote wellness and health for everyone. So we're trying to make this, available for all. And so at least in regards to thinking about health and wellness, not just health care, but across health and wellness, how can we make this the best for everyone? But if those in the medical field, those in the health professions, those in other aspects of society don't, take that into account about thinking about, we want to do the best for everybody. It just came to mind, so maybe I got to say this anyway. I'm not talking about communism, right? But how can we do the best for everybody? And if we do it like that, we actually, the old saying about, a rising tide lifts all boats. If we do the best for everybody, everybody gets better. Everybody feels better. Everybody is healthier. If we talk about those that are at the margins of society, those who are disadvantaged, if we help them, guess what? It helps out everybody as we move it along. All right, so now let me see if I can get back to the question that was asked about the moral issue of, rates being 20 to 25 times higher in certain populations. A part of the moral issue is we ought to be as concerned about those groups that are suffering, that have those higher rates, that are dying of higher rates. We ought to be concerned about them, because again, if we say, oh, it's just them over there, we don't have to worry about it. We're over here, me and my four, we're okay over here. We don't have to worry about those. Then again, our society starts to break down, if you will. So it does become a moral issue of us trying to address even the least of these, right? It brings to mind again. So I know it seems like I'm kind of wandering here, but it brings to mind again part of what Mr. Neal talked about. But to quote another philosopher, right? I was gonna quote Stevie Wonder, but I'm not gonna go there. I'm not gonna go there right now. But at least when Dr. King talked
He's a
about
good one.
he's a good one too, right? When you talk about the beloved community, what did that mean in terms of the beloved community? He was talking about, we're all caring for one another. So I think it's a moral issue if we allow, one group to have rates of mortality, rates of disease, rates of adverse health conditions that are 25 times higher than some other group, especially when we know some of the answers and we just haven't put those things into place yet. We need to be as concerned about, okay, well, why aren't we doing more in this group over here? And I think that's where the moral aspect comes. Okay, so I'll stop right there.
And I do believe that last question about it being a moral issue and what we can do as the National Center of Bioethics at Tuskegee with different HBCUs was offered to all of our presenters. So if either Dr. Earl or Mayor Neal, if you have anything to say, I'm sure the person who asked the question would love to hear it.
One of the things, and that's an excellent question, and thank you, Mr. Montgomery, for inviting us to comment. Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who is the current chair of SCLC for the board of SCLC, worked very closely with Dr. King. He taught me this. He's my best friend. He taught me this. He said that now nonviolence is not the absence of conflict.
Right.
It's the presence of justice. Right. And so until we can address the inequities, systemic inequities that exist within our society, and then work towards more an inclusive and pluralistic society, an egalitarian society, one that gives people opportunity to be the true and perfect manifestation of God's intent for them, right? Until we address that, until we begin to have value in the people who we think as least of these. Somewhere in the Bible, they say, when you do it to the least of these, you do it also unto me. And so these least of these people are the ones that we need to, as both Dr. Earl and Dr. Crosby, both of you all have alluded to the fact that until we deal, rising tides lifts all boats, Dr. Crosby, you are correct. Until we can do it to the least of these, none of us can be. It was Dr. King that talked about, I cannot be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you cannot be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be, because we're interrelated and interdependent. In that kind of connectivity, that humanity, that common humanity that we all share must be at the center of our conversation. And let me say this as I end my comments on this. I've been watching football and the different sports. I'm kind of a fanatic in that area. And I noticed how valuable those young black boys are when they got on them uniforms, and how they, when they have those balls, and when they're running the ball, and how concerned people are if they get injured during the course of the game, where they cannot contribute to the game any longer, and how people wait with bated breath to make sure that they can come back in the game, and how those same people seem not to be as concerned about the number of black boys that are being killed daily around this country due to gun violence. I think if we can associate that value of people, not just when they got a uniform and a ball, but because they are human beings, and that kind of sensitivity needs to present itself, as Dr. Warren talked about, in public policy, because public policy determines who gets what, when, where, and how, right? And until we begin to do that, then everything we do is an activity in futility.
If Dr. Earl, if you didn't have
Yes,
anything to
yes,
say,
sir. I do. Let me be as quick as say it quickly, because I agree with Mr. Neal and Dr. Crosby. But my concern is, and I like what he said, Mr. Neal said about the black athlete. I remember a situation at the University of Tennessee when I taught there, that another professor had pointed out to me, and he wrote it in the school newspaper. I think they called it the Rocket Top News or whatever, but student government sponsored it. But he said that he was talking about the racism in sports, and he said that one University of Tennessee's black player was tackled by another school's black player, because in those days they only had one or two on each team, right? And this guy told me that this white guy, faculty member, said this really happened, that a white guy jumped up in the stand and hollered, get that nigger off of our black player. That speaks volumes about the way they see the utilitarian value that they see in us in terms of athletics. I mean, and he didn't, I don't think the white professor said, the question is, did he understand the contradiction in his statement? And now he might have been, half drunk or whatever, but the issue is that whatever that was, half drunk or sober, he made a statement that speaks volumes about where we are in terms of racism as a society. But it also speaks volumes, and I'm trying to get back to us in historically black schools, because I think that if we don't, if the younger black, and I say this, the young black Americans, wherever I am, if we don't seek to see the value of those schools, whether we went to them or not, that we're going to lose a treasure trove in terms of of Western civilization and American culture. Because although middle-class blacks who were aspiring to be middle-class wanted to get their children away from those schools, they, I don't know, I got to send my kid to Harvard or Yale or wherever. They did not understand what those schools meant in the larger narrative of America, because our people thought that those schools were merely trying to civilize us. But what they missed is that those of us who came out of those schools sought to call white America into its failure to understand what civilization meant. Call them into accountability. And it was those of us who came, our generations and the generations before, who came out of those schools, who had been taught the values of the sacredness of them, And that becomes, and if we lose that as Black schools, you know, look at all the leadership that came out, whether it was Andy Young as mayor and then went on United Nations and then mayor of Atlanta. And he's been a treasure trove to the nation and the world in terms of his moral vision. But if we lose sight of that, and I could call many, many names, but if we lose sight of the value of those schools, the nation is already morally bankrupt. We'll be worse off than ever. So, Mr. Montgomery, and to your generation, I'm appealing to you. I am appealing to you to help us here and help us. I know Mr. Washington was such a pragmatist, Booker T, that he wanted to see us do less talk about things, less discussions, and to get results, physical, material results. We are at another stage in the society now. We are not industrialized America. We are high-tech America, which means that medicine has been changed because of that. And all of that we do, law has been changed because of technology, et cetera. So we are now we have the time to have conversations and discourses about what's right and wrong, about where we ought to be going, even when we talk about a robotic culture. What impact will this have on us as human agents, as moral agents? You know, I mean, will the judge be a robot? Will the jurors of the court be robots? And if so, somebody had to pre-program them. Destroying our youth by incarcerating them by the tens of thousands. In what way will the robotic culture exacerbate that kind of destruction of human worth and value? Thank you.
Thank you for that response. And our next question is from Dr. Betty.
Dr. Hodge, it looked like you were trying to say something.
Yeah, I'm about to say, thank you very much, Brother Montgomery, we're at the end. And so I just want to give the final touch and then close it out. Thank you so much, Brother Eric Montgomery. It has been such a blessing having you to guide us today, to host us today. I just want to say a couple of quick things as we close it out. I want to thank Dr. Oh, wait, I'm trying to get my screens right. This we have been doing this thing for 2 years. We still can't get. Okay, I'm ready. Okay, all right. First thing is, Mayor Neal. You know, I saw you when I saw you playing that guitar at the Millbanks thing. I said, and he's mayor and he plays the guitar. I said, this and your dear cousin. I said, Lily had. I said, wait a minute, what's he doing? He said, yeah, he does that too. So you are just a Renaissance man. But please, please, please tell your best friend, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, that as we speak, I'm looking at my degree from the American Baptist College, and he signed it. He was my president, one of the American Baptist College. So tell him David Hart said hello. Secondly, one of the things I did because I was a Kenyan, and I was Malcolm too, but I was, you know, all of us have a little bit of Malcolm, but a little depends on how upset you get. And so I was, I lived, Dr. Warren, in the Black neighborhood of Tulsa, in the inner city kind of thing, as close as I could, like where the teachers would live, like right on the edge of the Black community. So I lived by a recreation center in the basketball court because I wanted to be close to the young people. So one day I was there playing basketball, and this young guy, he's about 13, 14 years old. You know, when you're playing basketball, you have all this yapping that you have to do. And he said something that one of the young men thought was out of place. And he walked up to another young man And the one on the sideline pulled up his shirt. The guy put his hand on a 9mm and told the little guy, he said, "Say it again." And I said, "Fellas, wait a minute, brothers. That for that you want to end his life and your own?" So Mayor O'Neal, while you were speaking, you're both philosophical and pragmatic and down to earth. And same thing with you, Dr. Earl. You did the philosophical and down to earth. And Dr. Crosby, you just gave us all of these numbers. But I'm telling you, I'm still terrified because of what you just said, that the mindset of that guy, from a little comment, he was willing to throw it all away. And somehow, I love the Dr. Earl, I think what you were saying is somehow we have to get to, as you were saying, one of the things Dr. Reuben Warren, with the Bridge Builders program, with the bioethics program, what he preaches is what you're saying. Bioethics is nothing if we cannot get to these young folk. These are his words. These young folk, we got to get to these young, we got to change their minds. And so I just escalated or promoted Dr. Barry Williams up to a panelist so that he could share with us as we bring it close to this, very, very quickly, what's happening tomorrow. Because tomorrow, it's not over. This is tomorrow we got to deal with these. So we had the college students all week long. Tomorrow we go to the kids. So Dr. Williams is going to lead the procession to the kids tomorrow. So Dr. Williams, just give us 30 seconds on what are you doing tomorrow with those kids.
All right, sure. Tomorrow, me and Dr. Warren, we will go to the Tuskegee Institute Middle School. Dr. Adele Winfrey, she's going to present a program about her HYPE program. It'll be at 9:30 in the morning, and we're trying to get involved with the students of Macon County. We want to encourage them, and we're bringing in Dr. Adele Winfrey from Alabama. She's from Alabama. Anyway, Talladega. I couldn't think of the name of the program right then because this was on the spot. But I'm thanking you, Dr. Hodge. I'm looking forward to working with this speaker. She's a very dynamite lady, and she has a HYPE program titled HYPE. And she will be speaking with the young people tomorrow, and we are excited about it. So thank you, Dr. Hodge, for giving me this opportunity, and I'm bragging.
brag. Listen, each time we save one, we save a family. You know what I'm saying? Each time we save one, we save a family because the anguish that comes from gun violence. And I asked one of my neighbors one time, I said, "Have you ever seen somebody, he asked me, have you ever seen somebody die, shot and killed, Uncle David?" I said, well, yeah, I saw it one time, it was horrible. He said, "What, just one?" He said, "I walked over bodies." Where it's like we're in Mogadishu, it's like we're over in the Sudan or something. This is reality. I want to thank Dr. Alex Crosby for making himself available, for giving us all of this. It's not over. This is just the beginning. We are putting together a program for next year and years to come. So I thank you. You are helping us to shape the ideas of what's going to come next, the next iteration of the National Bioethics Center, what we do as we reach those who are the least lost and left out. I want to thank Ms. Mayor Omar Neal. Every time I see you, you put a smile on my face. You don't even know, but I'm here smiling. So I want to thank you. Every time we ask Mayor Neal to do something, he says yes. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Riggins Earl for being my pop. That's my mentor, for just being there and just being by my side through all of my ups and downs and intellectual pursuits. Thank you, Pop. I want to thank, I said before, Dr. Kathleen McDuffie, for Sister Lily Head, for Dr. Lachlan Furrow, for Dr. Riggins Earl for being on the team to put this together. I want to thank Dr. Barry Williams, Katina Griffith. You see her face there, but she's not, she's not saying much, but she's right up in there. Katina Griffith, working behind the scenes, Miss Belinda Thorpe, and Mr. Kevin Lee. I want to thank all of those at the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. Ms. Van Treese Hurd has just left us to go on to do some other things, fascinating things. So we want to thank her. She's actually signed on right now. So Ms. Hurd, it's good to see you. She has been a staple for this for many, many, many years. We want to thank you. Now, I move now to give our closing words to Director, our guru, our savant, our seer, our sage, Dr. Reuben Warren. Dr. Warren, give us a PHEI closeout for this week. Thank you, Dr. Everybody. I don't want to give he can't hear it, but a hand of applause for Dr. Reuben Warren, 50 years of service, not just in the National Center, but in total in public health, 50 years of service. Dr. Warren, we want to thank you and we appreciate your service to our community. Dr. Warren.
You have to feel the excitement and the commitment from Dr. Hodge. I mean, you cannot be around him and not understand what we've done and what we're going to do. This whole effort was not to talk about the past, that's important, but to talk about what we're going to do in the future and to get some marching orders. We don't sit in the Bioethics Center and figure out what to do. We reach out and listen and try to discern what we're hearing and translate that into action. Many of those things you'll see happening every day. For example, we are expanding the bioethics honors program to 2 other HBCUs in Alabama. So we'll have programs with other HBCUs this year. And that's going to be expansion. And quite frankly, we're going to the world. So we'll have bioethics honors program students all over the world as they matriculate through their educational process and beyond. Dr. Crosby, you've done a really good job to give CDC some credibility. They need it. And you were there long enough to understand where it was and where it ought to be, and you're taking it to where it ought to be at one of our institutions, at an HBCU. So thank you so much. And you certainly said it, but it made it real clear. You went to an HBCU, you went to Howard Med School. So see the product of what we can do. See the product of what we must do. And Dr. Earl, if you ever stop talking about the value and worth of our institutions, then I will stop listening. Don't ever stop, because the young folk need to hear where they need to be in order to make us all that we need to be. I am excited about where we're going because I look at young folk like Mr. Montgomery and others hosts, and they know what to do. All we need to do is tell them what we did wrong and let them not make that old mistake. They have some new ones to make. So we're excited about what they're gonna do and what they're already doing. It ain't over today. Tomorrow we have another opportunity to our banquet and luncheon session, which is going to be virtual, but it's hosted by the Voices for Our Father's Legacy Foundation. That's how we always open, with the Voices for Our Father's Legacy Foundation, and that's how we always close. They know more about those men than we will ever know. And we've got to listen to them and realize that what they bring to us is what we must take to the next generation. This has been a wonderful, not closing, but a wonderful closing of the PHEI, but a closing of the commemoration will be tomorrow. And I hope all of you will just tune in and hear some more. And again, thank you for everything. Dr. Hodge?
All right, as I close, I just want to show you all something. On my screen, this is what I see. Dr. Reuben Warren, Prairie View. Eric Montgomery, Tuskegee University. Omar Neal, Tuskegee University. Dr. Alice Crosby, Howard University. Dr. Riggins Earl, American Baptist College. Dr. Barry Williams, Tuskegee University, Alabama State. David Hodge, American Baptist College. HBCU representing. So I want to thank each of you that imagine those little schools that started as a result and because of slavery. Those little schools that started presented this panel of people today to discuss how to bring corrections to what was started some 165 years ago, when slaves, 57 years ago, when slavery so-called ended. Thank you so much, each and every one of you. Dr. Williams, we'll see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum, peace, shalom, and blessings upon you.